Any questions? Oh, yes, right. I've got to pass this over to you because otherwise the people online won't hear it. Can I ask, actually, if you could just introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Julia Denham. I work for BT and I've done 2 Exeter degrees, so that's nice. One biology and one business, woohoo. Thank you, Ian, that was really interesting. And I think over the last week I've been particularly in the land use and biodiversity bit, I've been really struck by most people don't get it. They don't even get this problem of putting a tree in the right place. But you've found a data solution that's worked. I was interested in how scalable that was, particularly in light of the vast amount of finance that is about to go into carbon offsetting projects and planting trees in lots of random places.
I'm going to start off just talking about it. So scale is something that we're very, very aware of. There's no point producing an answer that can only be used at sort of a nation level. Well, I'm not saying there's no point, but certainly that's no help to a farmer, that sort of stuff. So the system that I've just shown you there, at the moment, you can sort of get it down to pretty near to a farm level. But what we will be able to hit within the next 2 years is field level. And then it suddenly becomes relevant, not just as a planning tool for DEFRA, which we're already there, really, but a planning tool for somebody who owns and operates land. With regard to expanding outside the UK, so one thing I want to say is, the answer is as good as the data you've got, and we should always respect that. But generally, I would say that, first of all, as long as we remember, and this is a general thing for interdisciplinary science, we are not trying to produce the perfect answer that 10, 15, 20 years of, nice disciplinary research will give you. You can do that, and you'll be able to answer maybe one tight question, like what's the impact on nitrates or something like that, really, really well. But that's no help to a decision maker who's got to think about hundreds of different variables. What we're trying to do here is not produce perfect answers, it's produce better answers. And they will iterate and be better as time goes on. Okay, Alice, is that all right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it links to kind of a general point that I would raise around timeframes and scalability of lots of different solutions. So I'm not at all an expert on the land use side at all. But one of the things that has come out in another project that I was part of on the water, food, energy nexus is this issue about context being really key to some of the solutions that we come up with in relation to reducing emissions, and that doesn't even touch on the kind of the biodiversity side of it. And so this context specificity, it's really interesting hearing what you've been talking about here, because it's so important here as well. It's that the sort of idealized solutions that we can imagine and we can kind of project in climate models and integrated assessment models and so on. They are idealized solutions, and we know that in some areas we might get more bang for our buck, if you like, but in other areas actually maybe not. And they don't necessarily balance, and we do tend to be quite optimistic when we're talking about upscaling. And working in a school of engineering myself, in terms of any sort of large-scale infrastructure project, whether it's a sort of hard infrastructure or whether it's more land use and nature-based infrastructure, there are always things that slow it down and always things that make it more challenging to actually deliver in practice. And asking the right questions, putting the right factors in at the start is absolutely key. But I think that just recognising that any delay has an impact, the timeline matters. And so, I do think that questioning when we see big numbers, when we're seeing this upscaling, we just need to question, has the context, has the specificity been considered, have we asked the right questions in the first place? And therefore, if we're being a bit too optimistic, we just need to make sure that's communicated so that we know what the risks are.
Next, I'm actually going to go to the gentleman here because you got in earlier.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian. Colin Galbraith, Chairman of JNCC. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for the series of wonderful talks. A question for Ian and then one brief one for the Met Office, if I can. How do you build in the wider public benefit, Ian, into what you've done? I mean, it's economics, we've got biodiversity, but how do you assess the public interest in terms of wider benefit? And then the very simple one for Met Office is the heat maps were really interesting. How could they inform government policy in terms of overseas aid? Could we target areas that are going to be worst affected now so that we can maximise the benefit and head off some of that? Because you had various levels of heat coming through to the heat stress end. So two completely different questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. So I obviously I'll take the first and then I'll pass over to Rich. So the wider benefits. First of all, the reason why I took a little bit of time to explain the recreation one, you might have been surprised for me choosing that one rather than starting with carbon, say, is because what I wanted to convey is that the values that go into this are not my values. They are not values that have actually been, for example, calculated in some lab. They are the values associated with people's behaviour and what they're actually doing. There are difficulties and limits when you're trying to extrapolate from that to different environments in the future. So, for example, what will people's preferences and decisions about food consumption be like in 10, 20 years' time, when perhaps awareness of the consequences of different food choices will be even higher than it is now? Also, how do they change when, for example, policymakers come in and try and nudge that behaviour in a certain direction, maybe through fairly traditional old-style taxes, that sort of stuff, or through information or even the presentation of different choices. What I'd say is that what we're trying to do always is not trying to impose our values, but to try and discover what values are actually out there. But this is also why we don't try and value biodiversity, for example, because if I was to ask any of you, well, so how much for the goldfinch? How much for the striped shiner, for example? Okay. Fabulous creature, the striped shiner. As you know, it is a bird fish. You can ask people questions about things that don't actually exist, and they will sadly give you answers. So only ask sensible questions that people can reasonably answer. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So you're asking about the using the heat stress maps I was showing for. Well, you said international aid, I think was the phrase you used, or it was international development.
Yeah, that's right. I can see a real relevance to what UK, and not just UK, but other countries could do now to begin to really target those areas that are likely to be most effective.
So I guess it depends on what kind of timescales we're looking at. The loss and damage agenda is very important, and there's a lot more happening this year and previous COPs, and it gets higher and higher up the agenda. I guess this would be so that relates to helping countries deal with the climate change, which has kind of been imposed on them by the failure to act earlier and sooner. This would clearly be one factor which would be taken into account there. There's many others as well, sea level rise and so on. And you probably wouldn't want to take into account just the climate factors as well, but it certainly could be one part of that. That's kind of in the longer term, I guess. But also, this kind of thing could be thought about as for climate change adaptation in the nearer term, in a kind of more responsive way. If we can have the sort of nearer term predictions on sort of seasonal to into annual timescales to see ahead when there's going to be a severe event coming. We're probably not there yet, but this kind of thing could help with climate change adaptation. If we can see there's going to be a very, very hot season coming, then we can get things in place to help there as well. So that's something else to aspire to, I think, on the science side.
Hi, sorry, my name's James Hutton Mills. I'm an Exeter alumnus. I build large-scale renewable projects in Africa specifically. A broad question to the panelists. I think, in my opinion, one of the successes of COP this year, COP26, is that, to me, there's been an acceptance of science, an acceptance of the brute fact that carbon is going in the wrong direction. But the acceptance of that is something that wasn't there 10 years ago or 20 years ago across the board. So, but I think a second theme that's perhaps come out is the fact that the pushback country by country is from those emerging countries where their GDP per capita is lower than they'd like it to be, and where they would argue that they aren't big emitters. So I just want to ask the panelists how they think their research going forward can evolve to incorporate that type of theme. Where would you like to start?
So given it's Nature Day at COP26 today, I think I will also say that one of the successes of this COP is the fact that nature has featured so prominently in the first week, at least, in numerous events and discussions. So it's not just about climate, but I don't know if there's acceptance yet that we're also facing a biodiversity emergency. But the fact that they're, both being discussed at a climate conference is at least making some progress on that conversation. So in terms of the science, a better integrated approaches, I think, as this session has demonstrated, I think it's been really interesting to hear the perspectives of all the different fields and to bring experts in those fields together. And I think more of these conversations is what we need to have. And then hopefully, the science will evolve from these sorts of conversations, because traditionally these fields don't talk to each other. So, the science doesn't exist because we're in our own silos. So hopefully, now that there's an acceptance that nature and climate, they're interconnected at all levels, then a new perhaps science can come from this as well.
Yeah, so in terms of big emitting countries, one of the things that hopefully, as I say, I haven't been at the last few days of COP, so I haven't heard it directly, is recognised is that, a big emitter country it could be just because it's made up of a very large number of people, but with very low per capita emissions. And in terms of sort of incorporating what that means from an economic point of view, I think it's just very important not to just look at things like GDP growth when looking at development, looking at emission growth in countries with low per capita emissions. That being important from a kind of like development perspective, other development indicators are also key. And if we, one of the things that I would like to see more of, and I'd like to expand our research, if you like, to kind of incorporate more of, is how we kind of unpack that term growth in terms of development, in wealthy countries and development in developing countries, if that is the right term, which I don't think it probably is. So, in other words, there's a kind of an increase in income in a rich country that doesn't necessarily make a difference to the average, in terms of the wealth of that particular country. In wealth, when I talk about wealth, meaning how standards of living, life expectancy, education, and so on and so forth. But that might be absolutely crucial in another country where it's at a lower development, on the lower part of the development curve. And if we just kind of focus on the GDP growth being like a good thing per se, then we lose track of the fact that that's going to lead to an increase in emissions in wealthier countries, whilst it might be a good thing from a developing country perspective, but not necessarily going to, we don't want the transition to involve stakes, I guess, as some of the wealthier countries have made in terms of emissions and energy system development and so on. So just unpacking that kind of economic debate a bit more, looking at some of the other indicators that illustrate, benefit to society, but without increasing emissions, because we're so, trapped still with the GDP growth and emissions. Breaking that is a real challenge, and maybe part of it is looking at some of the other indicators that matter in terms of life expectancy, health, well-being, seeing friends and family, that kind of thing. So and I'd like to hear perhaps a bit more from Ian and others on if you know any more about that.
Well, okay, if you don't mind, something that really did trigger with me. So I have been extremely lucky. and it is mainly luck. In that I've made some sort of fairly random choices in life that have managed to find me in a position where I spend most of my time working with absolutely fascinating people like the panel here. People from different disciplines who are interested in actually combining together and recognising that only by doing that we will be able to address the complexity of problems and challenges that are addressing the world. I think we're making real progress here, but we've still got a huge way to go, and I still think we're rather limited in our conception of an integrated approach. So, I've been working with people like Rich for a fair while, well, ever since I went to Exeter. So you can see economics and climate change, and then we've got people like Gua on the ecology side. And increasingly, we're seeing more connections, say, with Alice and the engineering side. But there's still more to do here, and it's not just badge engineering of adding things on. This is really important. If we don't start connecting in ways to society and people, and understanding that people generally have no concept or connection, there's certainly no emotional connection with a lot of the arguments that researchers make, then we are really playing with fire. We're taking a huge risk on just hoping that the people in charge actually do listen to us and do act on this information. Sometimes, and we've seen that with, the previous 4 years in the USA, that isn't how it works out. So we actually need to understand better the connection to individuals and society, and actually try and connect in a way that is meaningful to them. Because that's actually, I think, a very important additional route to delivering the sustainable world that we want, and more equal world that we want. Okay, I'm going to actually... sorry, Rich, I'm just going to try and get some more questions in, because I think there were more. There's a lady over here. Oh, there's lots. Okay, I actually think that the gent at the back was the first one to stick his hand up, but I'm going to try and get to both the other questions.
Thank you. I actually had two questions. I'll try and condense it into one.
Right.
So I'm Peter Stark. I'm a climate scientist from University of Exeter, actually, and also at the Met Office, colleague of Rich, all of you, really. So I think, just responding to the previous gentleman's point, I agree with him that COP26, the policymakers for sure accepted the science. I'm not totally convinced they've accepted the urgency of that science. So relating, I guess, to Alice's perspective, which is really interesting, of course, I attended a session this morning in the Science Pavilion, which was about the oceans and cryosphere, where I learnt about the ocean dialogue. And so this picture of the overall budget of, the area under the curve you talked about, of course, applies to temperature. But of course, with sea level, we're talking about irreversible changes and things that, are not going to be reversible. So the longer that we stay above a certain temperature level, the longer we lock in these irreversible changes. So trying to get to a question and trying to relate it to the economics, which is something I don't know anything about. How do we... to do an analogy with your example of some things you can value and some things you can't. So, of course, the thing about sea level is that we potentially put whole people and whole nations at peril. How do we possibly value that more broadly? Or is that one of your categories that we say we can't value it, and therefore we have to just not do it?
Turn myself off, sorry. Economists talk about two types of value, marginal values and non-marginal values. Marginal values are, the price of beans gone down, I'll buy some more beans. That's absolutely great. And in a way, that sort of approach actually gets you quite a long way down the road. For example, it allows you to do things like changes in the amount of nutrients in water. Okay, that's something we can deal with within limits. What you can't deal with, what becomes non-marginal, is when there isn't any water. And the same thing applies to flooding. So sea level moves from here to here, and you live in, let's suppose we live in Devon. Actually makes almost no difference whatsoever, actually. We've got these 200-foot cliffs. Well, that's fine. You live in the Maldives, that is a non-marginal change. Okay, and we then have to think about: are we going to ignore non-marginal changes because they're not happening to us? Now, the economics actually is fairly clear on that, but the economics, I'd say sadly, doesn't always make the decisions. Economists actually are there to provide advice to decision makers. Why? Well, there's two reasons. One is they're not the elected representatives. And two is our advice, even when it's better than advice that we gave in the past, will never be perfect. It will never be comprehensive. And I'm okay with admitting that. I know economists that aren't. But that is the fact of it. When you're looking at non-marginal changes, like you're going to lose this entire... I took some from the Marshall Islands, It actually then becomes a moral and political issue about whether we're actually going to save that community and society or not. I can say this is a non-marginal change. I've said it with regard to biodiversity. Well, that's for two reasons. It's non-marginal and it's very difficult to measure. But we have to stop eroding biodiversity. I personally think we have to stop destroying island states like that. Right, I'm going to bring in another question. If I can just... Actually, yeah.
Hi, my name is Ananda. I had done my Masters in Climate Change and Finance from Imperial College and currently doing the Exeter MBA. Just regards the right place to plant the right tree. You showed the natural capital way which is being implemented by the British government. Is it being taken up by any other organizations like the UN to evaluate the impact of their RED Plus programs and encourage agroforestry in the tropical belt? Is there any research on that, any evidence worth sharing that can encourage planting right trees at the right scale at the right place? Second question is that with regards to biodiversity and permafrost, which figures I don't think any of the projections have taken into effect. Has there been any current research which links the two, like introduction of bovine species to slow down the thawing of the permafrost or something which is being looked into by your organization? Yeah, these two.
Okay, I'll answer the first one. The second one sounds really complicated, so I'm going to ask somebody else to answer that one. The answer is yes, but imperfectly, as you'd expect. So the United Nations have actually been quite a leader in this area. Particularly, actually, there's two types of analysis that economists do with regard to the environment. There's the sort of thing I showed you here. You can almost imagine that as a version of investment appraisal. You've got something that you're going to do. Where's the best place to put it? That sort of stuff. There's a much higher level question, which is, in which direction is your economy going, and is it sustainable overall? And that's an area to do with what's called natural capital accounting, and it's much more about the recognition that the measures that we have at the very highest level are inadequate. So the one that everybody is probably familiar with is gross domestic product, GDP. What that tells you about is the amount of money that's circulating around in the economy. And that actually is not an irrelevant issue. It tells you about jobs, that sort of stuff. But it's not sufficient. And it's not sufficient because you can increase GDP by running down the environment. So you have to have a second measure alongside it of what's actually happening, not just to our economic stocks, but to our stocks of nature as well. And that's where you get this term natural capital, which is not one I'm massively keen on, but you know, it is technically correct. And the UN have really pioneered the development of this second measure. With regard to the sort of stuff I do, which is sort of, I recognise, subservient to that, how do we actually choose between projects? It is growing. It's much more common now across Europe. Actually, if it wasn't for the political environment, you'd have seen a lot more of it going on in America over the last few years. I think you're going to see a lot more from now on. Okay, I'm going to pass on, and this will probably be the last answer.
Yeah, so you're asking about permafrost, and so you said it's not included in the climate models. Actually, it is starting to be. So some aspects of the permafrost thawing and feedbacks are now included in the Earth system models, but it's a lot more complex than we currently represent it. So it's clear that a lot more needs to be done. So just to clarify your question, were you asking, is there any research on slowing permafrost thawing through other means, through land use change and so on,
as well as biodiversity introduction or reintroduction, for example?
So I'm not actually sure. That's a really good question. I'm going to guess that there's not much that could be done other than don't make the climate warmer. But if anyone has any better answers than that, I'd be really happy to hear that.
So I would agree with that. I think do not make the climate warmer is the only answer. I don't think introducing any management action to prevent any sort of ill effects might work. I think what we'll have to do is adapt, because it's going to happen, and this is where biodiversity is probably going to be an ally, because we know that the more biodiverse our landscapes are, then the more likely they are to adapt to any changes in the landscape, and the quicker they will do so. So if there are any nature transformation programs happening in those places where the thawing of permafrost is happening quickest, then those places are likely to become more resilient to those changes in the future. So I think that's probably the action, the adaptation that needs to happen, as opposed to prevention or mitigation.
Thank you. We have unfortunately run out of time.